A judge laughs in a small-town courtroom, shouting, "Pick any wife for free." The crowd roars until the outlaw biker smirks and says, "I'll take the obese virgin." Everyone thinks it's a joke until the marriage papers are signed for real. Now, a broken man and a woman everyone mocked are bound together. Two outcasts trying to survive under the same leaking roof. But when the town turns against them, and his old biker gang comes looking for revenge, the joke that started it all becomes deadly serious. She believes faith can change even the hardest heart. He believes he's too far gone to be saved. But in a world that's already decided they don't deserve love, will grace be enough to rewrite their story? Or will the past burn everything they've built to ashes? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The Arizona summer heat pressed against the courthouse windows like a living thing, making the old building's air conditioning work overtime. Inside courtroom 3, dust motes danced in the shafts of afternoon sunlight, while Judge Harlan stared down at the familiar face before him with poorly concealed frustration. Ryder Cole stood at the defendant's table, his weathered leather jacket creaking as he shifted his weight. At 45 years old, his face told stories of hard miles and harder choices. Scars traced paths across his jaw, and his dark eyes held shadows that spoke of a past he couldn't outrun. "Mr. Cole," Judge Harlan drawled, flipping through the file with deliberate slowness. "Speeding on Highway 17, unpaid fines from your last 3 citations, and what's this? A bar fight at the Red Rock Saloon?" He peered over his reading glasses. "You're making this a habit, son." The small courtroom was only half full, mostly regulars who came to watch the daily parade of minor offenders. They'd seen Ryder here before, the ex-biker who couldn't seem to stay out of trouble. Ryder's voice came out like gravel. "Your Honor, about the bar fight." "Save it," Judge Harlan cut him off, holding up a hand. "I've heard all your explanations before. The other guy started it. You were just defending yourself, blah, blah, blah." He leaned back in his chair, the ancient wood creaking. "You know what I think your problem is, Cole?" Ryder remained silent, his jaw tight. "I think what you need is a wife." The judge's mouth twisted into a sardonic smile. "Yeah, that's right. Someone to keep you in line. Tell you what, pick any wife for free." He gestured broadly to the courtroom, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Laughter rippled through the spectators. Someone in the back whistled. Ryder's shoulders tensed, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. But in the last row of the courtroom, Layla Ruth sat very still, her heart suddenly beating faster. At 38, she'd spent most of her life trying to be invisible, which wasn't easy given her size. Her floral dress, chosen carefully to blend in, suddenly felt too tight, too noticeable. She watched Ryder's rigid posture, saw past the anger to something else, something that mirrored the loneliness she knew too well. The laughter was still echoing when Layla found herself standing. She didn't remember making the decision to move. Her legs trembled slightly, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "I'll marry him." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ancient air conditioning unit seemed to hold its breath. Every head turned toward her, and Layla felt the familiar flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. But she didn't sit down. Judge Harlan's mouth hung open for a moment before he recovered. "I'm sorry, miss." "Layla Ruth, Your Honor." Her voice was stronger now, though her hands were clasped tightly together to hide their shaking. Ryder had turned to stare at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and something darker. His eyes traveled over her, taking in her size, her plain face, her simple clothes, and his lip curled slightly. But Judge Harlan was warming to the idea, his earlier sarcasm transforming into something that looked disturbingly like amusement. "Well, well," he said, a glint in his eye. "Miss Ruth has made a generous offer, Mr. Cole, and since this was my suggestion—" He shuffled some papers on his desk, trying to hide his smile. "I'd be happy to officiate, right here, right now." "This is ridiculous," Ryder growled, but the judge held up his hand again. "What's ridiculous is your constant presence in my courtroom. Maybe this will teach you both a lesson." He gestured to his clerk. "Get me a marriage certificate." The clerk scurried off, and Layla made her way forward on unsteady legs. The other spectators watched in stunned silence as she approached the front of the courtroom. She could feel their stares, hear their whispered comments, but she kept her eyes fixed ahead. Ryder turned to face her fully when she reached him, and up close she could see the tiny scars that decorated his knuckles, the way his jaw worked as he clenched his teeth. His eyes were a stormy gray, and they bore into her with an intensity that made her want to shrink away. But she didn't. The clerk returned with the certificate, and Judge Harlan cleared his throat. "Well then, shall we proceed with this unusual ceremony?" Neither Ryder nor Layla spoke as the judge went through the bare minimum of legal requirements. When it was done, he pushed the certificate across his desk. "Congratulations," he said dryly. "You're husband and wife." Layla reached for the paper with trembling fingers, but Ryder snatched it first, crumpling it slightly in his large hand. He glared at her again, his expression a mix of anger and confusion, before turning on his heel and stalking toward the courtroom door. Layla stood there, her empty hand still halfway extended, as the heavy doors swung shut behind him. The certificate he'd taken was their only proof that this impossible moment had actually happened, and she had no idea what to do next. Judge Harlan cleared his throat again. "Court is adjourned," he announced, but his eyes lingered on Layla with something that might have been pity, or perhaps it was concern about what he'd just set in motion. The spectators began filing out, their whispers growing louder now. Layla remained rooted to the spot, her heart pounding in her chest. Through the courthouse windows, she could see Ryder in the parking lot, standing beside a gleaming black motorcycle, the marriage certificate still clutched in his fist. He looked up at the courthouse once, his expression unreadable at this distance, before swinging his leg over the bike and roaring away in a cloud of dust. The certificate fluttered from his hand as he rode off, dancing in the wind before settling in the courthouse parking lot. Layla watched it tumble across the pavement, the official document that had just changed both their lives, now no more than a piece of paper skittering away in the hot Arizona breeze. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the courthouse steps as Layla emerged into its glare. Her fingers gripped her worn leather purse so tightly her knuckles turned white, while camera flashes exploded around her like lightning. Local reporters, always eager for an unusual story, had somehow heard about the impromptu marriage and gathered outside. "Miss Ruth, what made you volunteer to marry a Hell's Angel? Mr. Cole, is this some kind of protest against the justice system?" The questions flew at them like arrows, making Layla's cheeks burn brighter than the Arizona heat. She ducked her head, trying to make herself smaller, an old habit that never worked given her size. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she carefully navigated the courthouse steps. Ryder stormed past her, his heavy boots thundering on the concrete. "This whole thing is a damn mistake," he muttered, loud enough for her to hear. His leather vest creaked as he moved, the sound sharp and angry like his movements. Behind them, the courthouse doors opened again, releasing a stream of spectators who'd witnessed their unusual ceremony. Their whispers and barely concealed laughter felt like sandpaper against Layla's skin. In her nervous state, Layla's foot caught on an uneven piece of concrete. She stumbled, her purse flying open, spilling its contents across the sun-baked pavement. Her small, well-worn Bible skidded through the dirt, coming to rest near Ryder's boots. He had already reached his motorcycle, a gleaming black Harley-Davidson that looked better maintained than anything else about him. But the sight of the Bible made him pause. His shoulders tensed, and for a moment he stood completely still. Layla scrambled to gather her scattered belongings, her face burning with shame. To her surprise, Ryder's weathered hand appeared in her field of vision, carefully picking up the Bible. He turned it over in his hands, his thumb running across the worn leather cover. "My mama had one just like this," he said, his voice rougher than before. Something flickered across his face, a shadow of memory perhaps, before his expression hardened again. He thrust the Bible back at her, then ran a hand through his graying hair with a heavy sigh. "Get on the bike." I've never—" Layla clutched the Bible to her chest. "Just hold on to me and lean when I lean. That's all there is to it." His voice was gruff but not unkind. Layla approached the motorcycle with trepidation. Ryder swung his leg over the seat with practiced ease, then watched as she struggled to figure out how to mount the bike without making a fool of herself. After what felt like an eternity, she managed to settle behind him, her thighs trembling with the effort of keeping her balance. "Hold on," he commanded, kick-starting the engine. The motorcycle roared to life beneath them, the vibration traveling up through Layla's body. Hesitantly, she placed her hands on either side of his waist. Ryder made an impatient sound and reached back, grabbing her wrists and pulling them all the way around his middle. "Unless you want to fall off, you need to hold on tight." The ride was terrifying and endless. They left the town behind, the paved roads giving way to dusty trails that wound through the desert landscape. Layla kept her eyes squeezed shut most of the way, her face pressed against Ryder's leather vest. Despite the heat, she could smell leather, motor oil, and something else, maybe whiskey, on his clothes. Finally, the motorcycle slowed and turned onto what felt like a gravel driveway. Layla opened her eyes to see a trailer home that had seen better days. The once white exterior had faded to a dingy gray, and rust streaked down from the window frames like tears. Ryder killed the engine and waited for Layla to dismount before swinging off the bike himself. Without a word, he stalked to the front door, unlocked it, and disappeared inside. Layla followed slowly, her legs still shaky from the ride. The interior of the trailer was dark and cluttered. Empty bottles littered every surface, and a stack of mail on the kitchen counter bore red, past-due stamps. The air smelled stale, like cigarette smoke and neglect. But what caught her eye was a single framed photograph on the wall. It showed an elderly woman with Ryder's gray eyes, her face creased with laugh lines as she smiled at the camera. The frame was dusty, but the glass had been recently cleaned, suggesting someone, Ryder, still cared enough to maintain this one small tribute. "Bathroom's through there if you need it," Ryder said, already pulling a fresh bottle from a cabinet. "Couch is yours. I'll get you a blanket." He disappeared into what must have been the bedroom, returning moments later with a faded quilt that smelled of mothballs. He tossed it onto the couch without ceremony, then retreated to his room with the bottle. The door closed with a decisive click. Layla stood in the middle of the living room, still clutching her purse and Bible. Through the thin walls, she could hear the clink of glass against glass, the sound of liquid being poured. She carefully arranged the quilt on the couch, trying not to think about what tomorrow might bring. As night fell, the trailer grew quiet, except for the occasional cough or shuffle from Ryder's room. Layla lay on the couch, her eyes adjusted enough to make out the elderly woman's photograph in the dim light filtering through the windows. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely audible above the desert winds outside. "Thank you for letting me do at least one kind thing for someone everyone else has given up on." She paused, her hand unconsciously reaching for the wedding band she wasn't wearing. Even if he has given up on himself. From the bedroom came the sound of soft snoring, suggesting Ryder had finally drunk himself to sleep. Layla pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders, breathing in its musty scent, and closed her eyes to wait for morning. The Arizona sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Layla woke on the lumpy couch. Her back ached, but her spirit felt light. She'd spent the night praying for guidance, and now she had a clear sense of purpose. After freshening up in the tiny bathroom, she took stock of the kitchen. The refrigerator held only condiments and beer, but she'd anticipated this. Yesterday, before the courthouse incident, she'd cashed her paycheck from the diner and bought groceries, a habit from years of careful budgeting. She retrieved the bags from her oversized purse and began unpacking. Eggs, bacon, bread, coffee, and basic necessities. The kitchen was grimy, but Layla had worked in worse conditions. She found a neglected coffee maker under a pile of papers and gave it a thorough cleaning before brewing a pot of strong coffee. The sizzle of bacon filled the trailer with its inviting aroma. Layla hummed softly as she worked, breaking eggs into a bowl and whisking them with practiced efficiency. The coffee maker gurgled its last drops just as heavy footsteps approached from the bedroom. Ryder appeared in the doorway, his face lined with confusion and suspicion. His gray hair stood up at odd angles, and yesterday's clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in them. "What are you doing?" "Good morning," Layla said cheerfully, sliding perfectly crisp bacon onto a paper towel. "Coffee's ready if you'd like some. Breakfast will be done in about 5 minutes." He stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. Finally, he moved to the coffee maker, pouring himself a cup. After taking a long sip, he leaned against the counter, watching her with narrowed eyes. "Why are you still here?" Layla focused on scrambling the eggs, adding a pinch of salt and pepper. "Well, we're married now. Even if it's temporary, I believe in honoring vows. I figure I'll stay for a week until they sort out the paperwork." This wasn't entirely true. In her heart, Layla knew she would stay as long as God told her to, but she sensed Ryder wasn't ready to hear that yet. "A week?" Ryder's voice was incredulous. "Listen, lady." "Layla," she corrected gently, sliding eggs onto 2 plates. "Whatever. You don't have to do this. It was a joke, remember? The judge was making fun of us both." She set a plate in front of him, complete with bacon and toast. "Maybe so, but sometimes God works in mysterious ways, even through jokes." She smiled, though her cheeks flushed at her own boldness. "Please, eat while it's hot." Ryder looked like he wanted to argue more, but the aroma of fresh breakfast proved too tempting. He sat at the small kitchen table and took a bite of eggs. His eyebrows rose slightly, surprised at finding them perfectly seasoned. They ate in silence, broken only by the scrape of forks against plates. Layla was about to clear the dishes when Ryder's phone rang. His expression darkened as he answered it. "Yeah?" His face grew more serious with each passing second. "How long?" A pause. "I'll be there." He ended the call and ran a hand through his disheveled hair, suddenly looking older and more vulnerable. "Everything okay?" Layla asked softly. "My mother," he said, his voice rough. "She's in hospice care. They say—" He cleared his throat. "They say she's declining fast." Layla set down the dishes she'd been gathering. "I'll go with you." "No." The word came out harsh, defensive. "You shouldn't be alone," she insisted gently. "And I'm good with sick people. I used to volunteer at the hospital before I started working full-time at the diner. Ryder looked like he wanted to refuse again, but something in his expression suggested he didn't have the energy to fight. Fine, but don't expect anything. She's been sick a long time. They took Ryder's pickup truck this time instead of the motorcycle. The drive to the hospice facility was tense and quiet. Layla noticed how Ryder's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, how his jaw clenched and unclenched rhythmically. The hospice was a low, peaceful building surrounded by desert gardens. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and artificial lavender. A nurse directed them to room 203, her expression softening with recognition when she saw Ryder. She's been asking for you, the nurse said quietly. Evelyn Cole lay in a hospital bed by the window, her thin frame barely making a bump under the blankets. Her gray hair was neatly combed, and despite her pallor, there was something graceful about her presence. Her eyes were closed when they entered, but they fluttered open at the sound of footsteps. Ryder, her voice was weak but clear. Hey, Mom. Ryder's gruff voice had softened to something almost gentle. I brought someone to meet you. Layla stepped forward, taking Evelyn's fragile hand in both of hers. Hello, Mrs. Cole. I'm Layla. Evelyn's tired eyes studied her face intently. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. You're the one, she whispered. You're the one I've been praying for. Layla felt tears prick at her eyes. She pulled a chair closer to the bed, still holding Evelyn's hand. Would you like me to pray with you? Evelyn nodded, her smile growing warmer. Layla bowed her head and began to pray, her voice soft but steady, speaking words of comfort and peace. She didn't notice Ryder step outside the door, but she could feel his presence there, watching. The afternoon passed slowly. Layla read from her Bible when Evelyn was awake, and sat in peaceful silence when she dozed. She helped the nurses adjust pillows and offered sips of water. Throughout it all, she maintained a gentle cheerfulness that seemed to lift some of the room's heavy atmosphere. As evening approached, Evelyn drifted into a deeper sleep. Layla remained in her chair, her own eyes growing heavy. She didn't mean to fall asleep, but the emotional weight of the past 2 days caught up with her. Ryder stood in the doorway, watching the two women. His mother's face was more peaceful than he'd seen it in years. And Layla, this strange, kind woman who'd walked into his life through a judge's cruel joke, looked like she belonged there, as if she'd always been part of their story. Something shifted in his chest, an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't name. He'd spent years building walls around himself, but watching Layla's simple acts of kindness toward his mother had created a hairline crack in those defenses. The desert sunset painted the room in soft oranges and pinks. In that gentle light, with his mother sleeping peacefully and Layla dozing in the uncomfortable hospital chair, Ryder felt the first stirring of something he'd thought long dead: hope. 3 days passed like a gentle tide, washing in and out with the rhythm of hospital monitors and quiet prayers. Layla barely left Evelyn's side, learning the small gestures that brought comfort. A cool cloth on her forehead, whispered psalms, or simply holding her frail hand. Ryder prowled the hallways like a caged animal, only entering the room when his mother was asleep. On the third evening, as the desert sun painted the hospital walls in soft amber, Evelyn's breathing changed. Layla recognized the shift immediately. She'd seen it before during her volunteering days. She pressed the call button and squeezed Evelyn's hand. Ryder, she called softly to where he stood in the doorway. I think it's time. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his weathered face tight with emotion. The nurses came and went quietly, checking vitals and adjusting medications for comfort. Layla moved to step away, to give mother and son privacy, but Evelyn's fingers tightened around hers with surprising strength. "Stay," Evelyn whispered. Her eyes, bright with fever, found Ryder's. "My boy," she breathed. "God sent her to you." Tears rolled down Layla's cheeks as she watched Ryder take his mother's other hand. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw his tough exterior crack. A single tear tracked down his face, catching in his stubble. Evelyn's breathing grew softer, more shallow. "I love you," she managed, looking at her son. Then her eyes closed, and with one last gentle exhale, she was gone. The room fell silent except for the muffled sobs that now racked Ryder's body. Layla stood perfectly still, letting him have this moment of raw grief. She continued holding Evelyn's hand until it grew cool, whispering prayers of gratitude for this woman who had loved her son so fiercely. The funeral was held 2 days later at a small church on the outskirts of town. The desert heat was relentless, making the mourners fan themselves with their programs. Layla sat in the back, wearing her best black dress, which still strained at the seams. She noticed the sideways glances, heard the whispered comments. "That's her, the one who married the biker in court. Can you imagine? The biker and the fat woman. Must be desperate for attention." Layla kept her eyes forward, focused on the flower-draped casket. The words couldn't hurt her. She'd heard worse over the years. What pained her was watching Ryder sit alone in the front pew, his broad shoulders rigid with tension. After the service, Layla returned to work at the diner. Life had to go on. Bills had to be paid. But the gossip followed her there too. Customers who'd been friendly for years now snickered behind their menus. Some made loud comments about attention-seeking stunts while she refilled their coffee cups. Through it all, Layla maintained her gentle smile. She'd learned long ago that kindness was a choice, not a reaction. When people left smaller tips or made jokes about her weight, she simply worked harder, stayed later, took on extra shifts. One particularly exhausting evening, after the dinner rush had ended, Layla was on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor. Her back ached, and her knees protested the hard tile, but the work needed doing. The bell above the door chimed, and she looked up to see Ryder standing there, looking uncomfortable in his leather jacket. "We're closed," she said softly, pushing herself to her feet with effort. "I know." He shifted his weight, glancing around the empty diner. I noticed the faucet was leaking when I picked up coffee this morning. Thought I could take a look at it, as a thank you, for what you did for my mom." Layla blinked in surprise. "You don't have to." "I want to," he interrupted, already rolling up his sleeves. "Where's your toolbox?" She led him to the kitchen, where the sink had indeed been dripping steadily for weeks. The owner had been promising to fix it, but never got around to it. Ryder got to work immediately, his large hands surprisingly deft with the small tools. Layla returned to her cleaning, but now the silence felt different, companionable rather than lonely. The steady sounds of Ryder's work mixed with the soft swish of her mop on the tiles. "My mom used to clean houses," Ryder said suddenly, his voice muffled from under the sink. "Worked herself to the bone to keep me fed. Never complained once." "She was a remarkable woman," Layla replied, wringing out her mop. "She raised a son who knows how to fix things. That's something." A grunt came from under the sink, followed by a muttered curse. Then the sound of metal against metal, and finally Ryder emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. "Try it now." Layla turned the faucet. The water flowed smooth and silent, no more drips. "Perfect," she smiled. "Thank you. Least I could do." He watched her test the water pressure, a strange expression on his face. "You don't deserve how they treat you here." People are just people, she shrugged. They have their own hurts, their own stories. That's what my mom would have said. The words seemed to surprise him as much as her. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A real laugh, deep and genuine. She would have liked you. Actually, she did like you. Layla found herself laughing, too, the sound echoing in the empty diner. It felt good, like breaking through a layer of ice to find warm water beneath. By the time she finished closing up, the sky had turned a dusty pink, shot through with streaks of orange. Ryder waited while she locked up, then fell into step beside her as she started walking home. "You don't have to walk me," she said. "I know." But he kept pace with her anyway, his long stride adjusting to match her shorter one. They walked in comfortable silence through the cooling evening air. The sunset painted everything in soft rose gold, making even the tired old buildings look beautiful. When they reached her small house, Layla paused at the bottom of the porch steps. "Thank you again for fixing the faucet," she said. Ryder nodded, watching as she climbed the steps to her front door. Something in his expression had changed. The hardness in his eyes had softened slightly. As she fumbled for her keys, he realized something that stopped him cold. This woman, who'd endured mockery with grace, who'd sat with his dying mother without complaint, who worked harder when people were cruel. She was the strongest person he'd ever met. Her strength wasn't in muscle or attitude, but in an unshakable faith and courage that made his own tough guy act seem hollow. The porch light came on, casting a warm glow around her figure. She gave him a small wave before disappearing inside, leaving him standing in the growing darkness, still trying to process this new understanding. The summer sun was barely peeking over the horizon when Layla's old pickup truck rattled down the dirt road leading to Ryder's trailer. She parked next to his Harley, the truck's bed loaded with cardboard boxes and a few pieces of worn furniture. Steam rose from a covered pan of fresh-baked biscuits on the passenger seat. Ryder emerged from the trailer, coffee mug in hand, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. "What's all this?" Layla climbed down from the truck, clutching the pan of biscuits. "Breakfast first," she said simply, climbing the rickety steps to the trailer's door. She brushed past him into the kitchen, where she set the pan on the counter and began gathering plates. "You're not staying," Ryder said, following her inside. "This isn't part of the deal." Layla continued setting the table as if she hadn't heard him. "These biscuits need butter while they're hot." She finally looked up at him, her eyes gentle but determined. "And yes, I am staying. We're married, remember?" "That was a joke. A stupid court joke that went too far." "Maybe," she agreed, placing a warm biscuit on his plate. "But I'm here now, and that roof won't fix itself." Ryder stared at her, then at the biscuit, then back at her. "The roof? It's leaking in 3 places. I counted during the last rain." She buttered her own biscuit. "And the yard needs clearing, and those windows." She gestured to the cracked panes. "Listen, lady." "Layla," she corrected gently. "My name is Layla." He ran a hand through his graying hair in frustration. "Layla, you can't just move in here. This isn't some charity case you can fix up." She took a bite of her biscuit, considering his words. "No, it's not charity. It's home. Our home, if we choose to make it one." She stood and walked to the truck. "Now, are you going to help me with these boxes, or do I need to carry them all myself?" Ryder watched her through the window as she lifted a box, her movements slow but determined. Something in him, perhaps his mother's voice in his head, wouldn't let her struggle alone. With a muttered curse, he stormed out to help. They spent the morning moving her belongings. Not many, just the essentials of a simple life. books, cooking supplies, some clothes, and a box marked Home Things in neat handwriting. By afternoon, evidence of her presence had begun to appear. Lace curtains softening the harsh window light, a vase of wildflowers on the kitchen table, and small cards with scripture verses taped carefully above the sink. "Be strong and courageous," Ryder read aloud from one of the cards, his voice gruff. "That what you think this is? Being courageous?" Layla was arranging her cookbooks on a shelf. "No," she replied. "This is just being faithful. Courage is what you show every day, facing a world that's already decided who you are." He turned to her sharply. "And who do you think I am?" She met his gaze steadily. "A man who forgot who he was. Not a monster, Ryder. Just someone who lost his way for a while." The words hit him like a physical blow. He turned away, unable to bear the kindness in her eyes. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," she said softly. "I know you held your mother's hand every day in hospice. I know you fix things that are broken, and I know you helped a stranger with her boxes today, even though you didn't want to." Ryder stood silent for a long moment, then grabbed his tool belt from its hook. "The roof won't fix itself," he muttered, heading outside. Over the next few days, a routine began to form. They would work on the trailer during the day, Ryder handling the heavy repairs while Layla cleaned years of neglect away. She'd leave for her shifts at the diner, returning with groceries or supplies. Each evening, they'd share a meal at the small kitchen table, the conversation gradually becoming easier. One afternoon, while Ryder was replacing rotted boards on the roof, Layla appeared with a glass of lemonade. "The yard's looking better," she called up to him. He paused to wipe sweat from his forehead, looking over the space she'd been clearing. The old car parts and debris were gone, replaced by neat piles of usable materials and the beginnings of a small garden plot. "Didn't ask you to do all that," he said, but there was no bite in his words anymore. "I know." She smiled. "But I like growing things." That evening, after a simple dinner of meatloaf and potatoes, they sat on the trailer's small porch. The summer night was warm, and fireflies had begun to dance across the newly cleared yard. Their gentle lights reflected in the clean windows, now properly sealed against the elements. "My mama used to call them God's nightlights," Layla said softly, watching the fireflies. "Said they were there to remind us that light always finds a way to shine, even in the dark." Ryder leaned against the porch railing, his usual tension somehow softer in the evening air. "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Layla smiled. "She taught me that home isn't just a place. It's the feeling you get when you're where you're supposed to be." The words hung in the warm air between them. Ryder watched another firefly blink past, remembering how just weeks ago, sitting on this same porch had felt like a punishment, another mark of how far he'd fallen. Now, with the sound of crickets chirping and the soft presence of the woman beside him, it felt different. Not a punishment at all, but something else entirely. He glanced at Layla, who was still watching the fireflies with a peaceful expression. The sight stirred something in his chest. Not the shame or anger he was used to, but a quieter feeling, like coming in from the cold to find a light left on. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains as Layla stood at the stove, watching Ryder struggle with an egg. His large hands, more accustomed to wrenches and motorcycle parts, held the spatula awkwardly. "Gentle," she coached, standing beside him. "Like you're turning the pages of a book, not fixing an engine." Ryder's brow furrowed in concentration. "Books don't spit hot grease at you," he muttered, but his movements became more careful. The egg yolk remained intact this time as he flipped it. "See?" Layla beamed. "Perfect." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. First time for everything, I guess. Later that week, Ryder wheeled his Harley into the yard. Your turn to learn something, he announced. Layla's eyes widened. Oh, I don't know about that. Come on, he encouraged, patting the seat. Just balancing first. Engine off. She approached hesitantly, her hands twisting the hem of her dress. I've never even sat on one before. Here. Ryder held out his hand, strong and steady. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, letting him guide her onto the motorcycle. Her weight settled onto the seat, and he kept the bike steady while she found her balance. That's it, he said softly. Just feel how it wants to stay upright. Layla's nervous giggles turned to genuine laughter as she grew more confident. I'm doing it, she exclaimed, her joy echoing down the quiet road. Ryder found himself chuckling too, her enthusiasm infectious. Sunday morning brought a different kind of challenge. They walked up the church steps together, Layla in her best floral dress, Ryder uncomfortable in clean jeans and a pressed shirt. The whispers started immediately. Elderly women clutched their purses closer, and fathers steered their children to different pews. Layla's chin lifted slightly, but her hand trembled as she opened her Bible. Ryder sat rigid beside her, his jaw clenched against the judgment radiating from the congregation. Pastor Jerome took the pulpit, his warm brown eyes scanning the assembled faces before landing on Ryder. Today, he began in his rich baritone, we're going to talk about mercy. The sermon wove through stories of redemption, of second chances, of hearts transformed by love. Mercy, Pastor Jerome emphasized, isn't just about forgiveness. It's about seeing people as God sees them, not for who they were, but for who they're becoming. Throughout the service, his gaze returned to Ryder, not with condemnation, but with understanding. When the final hymn ended, he made his way through the crowd to greet them. Brother Ryder, he said, extending his hand. Good to see you here. Ryder hesitated before accepting the handshake. Pastor? And Sister Layla, Jerome continued, his smile genuine. You're a blessing to this congregation. As weeks passed, the town's attitude began to shift. Curious glances replaced suspicious stares. At the diner, customers who once whispered behind their menus now asked Layla how the trailer renovations were coming along. One evening, they decided to host a neighborhood barbecue. Layla spent the morning preparing potato salad and baking pies, while Ryder cleaned the grill he'd repaired. The yard, now neat and welcoming, filled with folding chairs and card tables borrowed from the church. To their surprise, people came. First Pastor Jerome and his wife, then a few regulars from the diner, then some of Ryder's mechanics' clients. Children chased fireflies while adults gathered around the grill, drawn by the smell of smoking meat and the sound of easy laughter. Later that night, after the last guest had gone home, they sat on the porch steps. The air was heavy with the lingering scent of barbecue and summer flowers from Layla's new garden. Never thought I'd see the day, Ryder said quietly, when decent folks would sit at my table. Layla touched his arm gently. You've always been decent, Ryder. They're just finally seeing it. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the darkness. There's things I need to tell you, he said finally. Things you should know. Only if you want to, she replied softly. The words came slowly at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. He told her about the fights, not just scraps, but brutal battles that left men broken. About running drugs for the angels, the rush of power and the crushing weight of guilt. About the years in prison, marked by violence and survival. Layla listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, silence stretched between them. "The man who did those things," she said finally, her voice gentle but firm, "isn't the man I see now." Ryder turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face for any sign of fear or judgment. Instead, he found only compassion and something deeper, something that made his heart beat faster. A strand of hair had fallen across her cheek, catching the porch light. Without thinking, he reached out, his rough fingers gentle as he tucked it behind her ear. Layla's breath caught, a blush spreading across her face. The night air seemed to thicken around them, heavy with unspoken words and possibility. The moment stretched between them, tender and new, like a flower just beginning to bloom. Neither spoke, afraid to break the spell that had fallen over the summer night, filled with the song of crickets and the soft whisper of hope. Dark clouds rolled across the Arizona sky like angry bruises, bringing an unseasonable storm that made the desert air thick and heavy. At the small white church on Pine Street, Layla stood with several other women from the congregation, watching anxiously as rain pelted the aging roof. A tremendous crack split the air. Lightning illuminated the church steeple for a brief, brilliant moment before a gust of wind tore through, ripping away a large section of shingles and exposing the wooden beams beneath. "Dear Lord," Pastor Jerome breathed, watching helplessly as rain poured into the sanctuary through the gaping hole. Without hesitation, Ryder stepped forward, already shrugging off his leather jacket. "I can fix it," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Brother Cole, it's too dangerous," Pastor Jerome protested, gesturing at the darkening sky. "The storm." "Storm ain't waiting for better weather," Ryder replied. He was already gathering tools from his truck, his movements quick and purposeful. "And neither am I." Layla's heart hammered in her chest as she watched him position the ladder against the church wall. "Please be careful," she called out, her voice nearly lost in the wind. Ryder paused halfway up the ladder to look back at her. His smile was gentle, meant just for her. "Always am, darlin'." The women of the congregation gathered in a tight circle near the church steps, their heads bowed in prayer. Layla could hear Mrs. Henderson's trembling voice leading them. "Lord, protect him as he does your work." Rain streamed down Ryder's face as he worked, his t-shirt plastered to his skin. His movements were careful but confident as he secured new shingles over the hole, hammering steadily despite the wind that threatened to knock him off balance. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Layla's heart stopped as Ryder's foot slipped on the slick roof. He caught himself quickly, one hand gripping the cross that topped the church. "Ryder!" Layla's cry carried over the storm. He laughed, a sound of defiance against the elements. "Not going back to hell that easy," he shouted down, his voice strong and clear. "Got too much to live for now?" The storm raged on, but Ryder worked steadily, refusing to leave until the job was done. As he hammered the last shingle into place, the clouds began to part. Sunlight broke through in golden shafts, illuminating the church like a divine blessing. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause as Ryder descended the ladder. Layla rushed forward with a towel, her hands shaking as she helped dry his face and arms. "Maybe I found my calling after all," he joked softly, his eyes twinkling as he looked down at her. "Fixing things that need fixing." "You already had that calling," Layla whispered. "You fixed me." The moment stretched between them, charged with something more powerful than the lightning that had lit up the sky. Ryder's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a raindrop. Or maybe it was a tear. Beneath the newly repaired cross, with the whole congregation watching, Ryder Cole kissed Layla Ruth for the first time. It was gentle and sweet, like a prayer answered after years of waiting. Someone in the crowd whistled and others clapped, but Layla barely heard them. In that moment, the whole world had narrowed to just the two of them. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch of their trailer watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of pink and gold, a truck pulled up to their mailbox. The driver didn't get out, just dropped something in the box and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Ryder's body tensed as he recognized the black horn symbol on the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with a message that made his blood run cold. One last job, for old time's sake. Without hesitation, he struck a match and burned the note, watching as the flames consumed the words. But he couldn't burn away the unease that settled in his gut like lead. Layla noticed the change in him immediately. She always could. Read him, even when he tried to hide his feelings. "What is it?" she asked softly, her hand finding his. "Nothing to worry about," he said, but his eyes kept scanning the horizon, watching for headlights that shouldn't be there. The desert wind picked up, rattling the window frames of their little trailer. Ryder pulled Layla closer, wrapping his arms around her like a shield. "No one's ever gonna hurt you," he whispered into her hair, his voice fierce with protection and love. "I promise you that." The wind continued to howl outside, carrying with it the scent of rain and danger. But inside their home, Layla felt safe in Ryder's arms, protected by the strength of his love and the depth of his transformation. She offered up a silent prayer of thanks for the man who had become her shelter in every storm. The acrid smell of smoke jolted Ryder from his sleep. His eyes snapped open, instantly alert from years of living on edge. The clock by the bedside read 4:37 in the morning. Through the window, an orange glow painted the pre-dawn sky above Main Street. "Layla," he whispered, shaking her shoulder gently. "Wake up, darlin'. Something's burning in town." She stirred, blinking sleepily. "What's wrong?" Before he could answer, the town's fire siren began its mournful wail. They rushed to the window together, and Layla's face went pale. That's coming from my diner." Ryder was already pulling on his boots. "Stay here," he ordered, but Layla was right behind him, throwing on her coat over her nightgown. "It's my workplace," she said firmly. "I'm coming." They roared into town on Ryder's Harley, the wind whipping tears from their eyes. The smell of smoke grew stronger with each block. When they rounded the corner onto Main Street, flames were already shooting through the roof of the Happy Heart diner. "No," Layla whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, no." The town's volunteer fire department hadn't arrived yet. Without hesitation, Ryder began organizing the gathering crowd of onlookers into a bucket brigade from the hardware store's water barrels to the burning building. "You there!" he shouted to a group of men watching helplessly. "Get those garden hoses from the flower shop, and someone break into the general store. We need more buckets!" People responded to the authority in his voice, falling into line. Even those who usually crossed the street to avoid him now worked alongside him, passing buckets hand to hand. Layla stood frozen, watching her workplace, her sanctuary, burn. The fire truck's sirens grew closer as dawn began to break. Ryder had stripped off his shirt, using it as a makeshift mask to venture closer to the flames. He emerged coughing, supporting elderly Mr. Wilson, who had been trying to save the cash register. "The kitchen's gone," Ryder reported grimly to Layla, "but we might save the dining room if—" "Hold it right there, Cole." Sheriff Mark Tanner's voice cut through the chaos like a knife. He stood behind Ryder, his hand resting meaningfully on his holster. Two deputies flanked him. "Turn around slowly," Tanner ordered. "Hands where I can see them." Ryder complied, his expression darkening as he recognized the look in the sheriff's eyes. He'd seen it too many times before. Judgment already passed. Sentence decided. "What's this about, Sheriff?" he asked quietly. "3 witnesses place you near the diner around midnight," Tanner said, producing his handcuffs. "And we both know your history with arson charges." "That's impossible!" Layla stepped forward, her voice stronger than anyone had ever heard it. "Ryder was home with me all night. We went to bed at 10 o'clock. He never left." The sheriff's expression softened slightly when he looked at her, but his voice remained firm. "Mrs. Cole, I know you want to protect him, but nothing." Layla's hands were shaking, but her chin was lifted high. "I'm telling you the truth. Ryder's changed. He would never do this." More people had gathered now, watching the scene unfold. The firefighters worked in the background, their hoses finally making headway against the flames. As the smoke began to clear, something became visible on the diner's surviving wall. A crude painting of a black horn, still wet and dripping. Ryder's face went ashen. He knew that symbol, had worn it proudly once. Now it was a message meant just for him. This is what happens when you try to leave the past behind. "That's gang activity," Tanner said grimly, "and we all know which gang you used to run with, Cole." He stepped forward with the handcuffs. "You have the right to remain silent." "Please," Layla begged, tears streaming down her face. "He's innocent. You have to believe me." But the townspeople were already backing away, their brief moment of unity forgotten. Mothers pulled their children close, shopkeepers locked their doors. The old whispers started again. "Once a criminal, always a criminal." Ryder didn't resist as Tanner cuffed him. His eyes were fixed on Layla, trying to convey everything he couldn't say. "I'm sorry. I love you. This isn't what it looks like." Layla pushed through the deputies to grab Ryder's hand. Her fingers were ice cold, but her grip was strong. "I believe in you," she whispered fiercely. "God knows the truth." But as the deputies led Ryder toward the patrol car, Layla felt something inside her crack. She'd always believed that faith could move mountains, that love could transform the hardest heart. Now, watching the town turn against them again, watching the smoke rise from her ruined diner, that faith began to splinter. The morning sun finally broke over the horizon, illuminating the scene in harsh detail. The blackened walls of the diner, the puddles of water reflecting red and blue police lights, the crowd of onlookers already turning away, and Layla Ruth Cole, standing alone in her nightgown and coat, watching her husband being driven away in handcuffs, while her world burned down around her. The gang's symbol seemed to mock her from the wall, a reminder that the past was never truly past, that redemption came with a price. As she sank to her knees on the wet pavement, her prayers turned to quiet sobs, and the judgment of the town pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. The acrid smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air as night fell over the charred remains of the diner. Layla knelt in what used to be her kitchen, surrounded by blackened walls and melted equipment. The floor was slick with water from the firefighters' hoses, soaking through her worn dress, but she barely noticed. "Please, Lord," she whispered, her voice trembling, "give me strength. Show me the way forward." Moonlight filtered through the hole in the roof, casting eerie shadows across the devastation. The place that had been her sanctuary, where she'd found purpose in feeding others and sharing kindness, was now a hollow shell. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched her Bible close to her chest. "I know in my heart Ryder didn't do this," she prayed. "But sometimes knowing isn't enough, is it, Lord?" A cold wind whistled through the broken windows, making her shiver. With no insurance and barely any savings, she couldn't afford to rent an apartment. The diner had been her lifeline, providing both income and a sense of belonging. Now it was gone, along with her husband. Pastor Jerome found her there just before midnight, still on her knees in prayer. "Child," he said gently, his deep voice echoing in the empty space. "You can't stay here. It's not safe." Layla looked up at him, her face streaked with soot and tears. "Where else can I go?" "The church basement has a cot," he offered, extending his hand to help her up. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry." She accepted his help, her legs stiff from hours of kneeling. "I don't want to be a burden." "You've never been a burden, Layla," Pastor Jerome said firmly. "You're family, and family takes care of each other." The basement was humble, just a small room with a narrow cot, a lamp, and a few boxes of donated clothes. But it was clean and safe, and most importantly, it was close to the jail where Ryder was being held. Every morning, Layla would wake before dawn and make her way to the jail's outer wall. There was a small window high up, barred but open to the fresh air. She knew Ryder could hear her from his cell inside. "Good morning, my love," she would say, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet morning air. "I'm here to pray with you." Sometimes other inmates would mock her, calling out crude jokes or mimicking her prayers. But she never stopped coming, never stopped lifting her voice in faith, even when Ryder remained silent. Inside his cell, Ryder fought his own battles. The other inmates, many of whom knew his reputation from his Hell's Angels days, tried to provoke him into fights. They shoved him in the yard, spat in his food, called him names designed to make him snap. But Layla's words echoed in his mind. "True strength isn't in your fists, it's in your heart." So he remained calm, letting their taunts wash over him like water. When a muscled inmate twice his size tried to start a fight in the shower, Ryder simply walked away. The old Ryder would have put the man in the infirmary. But he wasn't that man anymore. One particularly difficult morning, after a night of little sleep and endless harassment, Ryder finally approached the window during Layla's prayer time. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "Your faith in me, your prayers, any of it." Layla's heart leaped at the sound of his voice. "Love isn't about deserving," she replied. "It's about choosing, and I choose you, Ryder Cole, every single day." Days passed this way, with Layla dividing her time between prayer at the jail window and helping at the church. She sorted donations, cleaned the sanctuary, and cooked meals for the homeless. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from dwelling too long on their situation. Then, on a Wednesday morning, Pastor Jerome burst into the basement, his usually calm demeanor replaced with urgent excitement. "Layla," he called out, "I've just heard something important." She looked up from the Bible she'd been reading, hope flickering in her tired eyes. "One of my old Marine buddies. He's a bartender now over in Mesa," Pastor Jerome explained, catching his breath. "He called to tell me about a man who came into his bar last night, a former gang member drinking and bragging about how they'd taught that holy roller biker a lesson. Said something about framing him good." Layla stood up so quickly she knocked over her chair. "Did he get a name? A description?" "Better," Pastor Jerome smiled. "He got it all on video. The bar has security cameras with audio." For the first time in days, real hope blazed in Layla's heart. This was what they needed, proof of Ryder's innocence. But she knew it wouldn't be simple. Sheriff Tanner had already made up his mind about Ryder's guilt. She spent the next hour in prayer, asking for guidance. When she opened her eyes, she knew what she had to do. It wasn't enough to have faith. She needed to act on it. Gathering her well-worn Bible and the little notebook where she'd been keeping track of everything she remembered from the night of the fire, Layla stood up. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was steady as she spoke to Pastor Jerome. "I'm going to the sheriff's office," she said. We need to gather every piece of evidence we can find. Security footage from nearby stores, witness statements, everything. Pastor Jerome nodded approvingly. Would you like me to come with you? Layla shook her head. No, thank you, Pastor. This is something I need to do myself. She paused at the church door, taking a deep breath of the morning air. The sheriff's office was just down the street, its windows gleaming in the early sunlight. Her Bible felt solid and reassuring in her hands, a reminder that truth, like faith, required both courage and action. With one final prayer for strength, Layla stepped out into the morning light and began walking toward the sheriff's office. Each step felt like a declaration of love, of faith, of determination to see justice done. She might be poor, she might be looked down upon by the town, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. God hadn't brought her and Ryder together just to let their story end in ashes and chains. Layla spent the next few days walking the dusty streets of their small Arizona town, notebook in hand. Her feet ached, but her determination never wavered. She talked to everyone who might have seen something the night of the fire. Shop owners, late-night workers, even the homeless people who often gathered behind the diner. Most doors closed in her face. Some people laughed. But on her third day of searching, she met Tommy, a young drifter with kind eyes and worn-out shoes. I saw something that night, he said, fidgeting with his baseball cap. I was sleeping in the alley when these guys showed up. Big guys in leather jackets. They weren't local. I know all the regulars around here. They were hanging around the back door, then took off real quick before the smoke started. Layla's hands shook as she wrote down every detail. Meanwhile, in the county jail, Ryder was fighting his own battle. During lunch, he overheard his cellmate whispering about a planned attack on the guards during dinner. The old Ryder would have kept quiet, but Layla's voice echoed in his mind. Do what's right, even when it's hard. He reported the threat to Officer Martinez. That evening, when 6 inmates tried to jump the guards in the cafeteria, they were ready. No one got hurt. The warden visited Ryder's cell the next morning. That was decent of you, Cole. I'm putting in a word for an early hearing. Layla gathered all her evidence, Tommy's statement, security footage from nearby stores, and statements from other witnesses, and brought it to Judge Harlan's office. Her hands trembled as she laid out her findings. The judge listened, his stern face softening as she spoke. You've done good work here, Mrs. Cole, he said finally. I'll review everything personally. That night, exhausted but hopeful, Layla fell into a deep sleep on her cot in the church basement. In her dreams, Evelyn appeared, radiant and smiling. You're doing God's work, child. Evelyn's voice was warm and clear. Don't give up now. Layla woke to Pastor Jerome, knocking on her door. They've set Ryder's hearing for tomorrow morning, he announced. Judge Harlan wants to see all the evidence first thing. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as people filed in, filling the wooden benches. Layla smoothed her dress with trembling hands, remembering the day, just months ago, when she'd stood up in this very room and changed both their lives. Judge Harlan sat at his bench, his weathered face unreadable as he shuffled through papers. The morning light streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. When called to testify, Layla's voice started soft but grew stronger with each word. I've watched Ryder change, she said, her eyes bright with tears. He fixed the church roof in a storm. He helps our neighbors. He cooks meals for the elderly. She paused, gathering courage. The man who stands accused today spent Christmas morning delivering presents to children at the shelter. Sheriff Tanner stepped forward next, looking uncomfortable but determined. Your Honor, new evidence has come to light. He laid out the security footage, witness statements, and a signed confession from a Black Horns member who'd bragged about framing Ryder. The fire was an act of revenge, Tanner admitted. We were wrong about Cole." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Harlan studied Ryder, who stood straight and calm, his eyes fixed on Layla. The judge removed his glasses, cleaned them slowly, and spoke. "Months ago, I made a joke in this very courtroom," he said. "I told you to pick any wife for free." He shook his head, a slight smile touching his lips. "You chose the one woman nobody else wanted, and she saved you all." The words hung in the air for a moment before he continued. "All charges are dismissed." Joy erupted in the courtroom. People stood, clapping and crying. Layla ran to Ryder, who caught her in his arms, holding her tight against his chest. Together they walked out of the courthouse, their fingers intertwined. The townsfolk lined the steps, watching in respectful silence as the couple passed. Where once there had been mockery, now there was only quiet awe, living proof that grace could transform even the most unlikely love story. The autumn breeze carried the scent of sage and desert wildflowers as golden light painted the landscape. Outside the newly opened Cole's Custom Cycles, the sound of wrenches turning and friendly chatter drifted through the open garage doors. Ryder moved between 3 workstations, guiding his employees, all men with stories similar to his own, through the intricacies of motorcycle repair. "Remember, gentle with that gasket," he called out to Marcus, a former inmate learning the trade. "Treat her like she's precious." Next door, the warmth of fresh-baked pies wafted from the Grace Stop, where Layla had created more than just a diner. She'd built a sanctuary. The walls, painted in soft yellow, held framed photos of smiling customers and Bible verses written in her careful hand. The bell above the door chimed constantly as folks came and went, drawn by both the food and the atmosphere of acceptance that filled every corner. Every Sunday afternoon, the parking lot filled with a mix of vehicles, old pickup trucks, worn sedans, and the occasional motorcycle. Veterans wearing faded military caps sat beside widows in their Sunday best, while families who couldn't afford a meal elsewhere found plates heaped with home-cooked food placed before them, no questions asked. Judge Harlan became a regular, claiming the corner booth as his unofficial office. This particular afternoon, he sat nursing his 3rd cup of coffee, watching as Layla moved among the tables with effortless grace. "Best coffee in 3 counties," he called out as she passed. Then, with a knowing smile, he added, "Guess you really did pick the right wife, for free." Layla blushed, but her eyes sparkled with joy as she glanced through the window at Ryder working in his shop. The joke that once stung now felt like a blessing, a reminder of how God could turn mockery into miracle. As evening approached, Ryder closed up shop while Layla handed out the last pieces of pie to departing customers. He wheeled his Harley to the front of the diner, the chrome gleaming in the fading light. Without a word, Layla climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist, a gesture that felt as natural as breathing now. They rode through the desert as the sun began its descent, the cooling air carrying the day's last warmth. Ryder guided the bike to their favorite spot, a rise overlooking the valleys and mountains beyond. They dismounted, and he took her hand, leading her to a smooth boulder where they could watch the sun paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. As the first stars began to appear, Ryder turned to face her. His weathered face softened, eyes filled with a tenderness reserved only for her. "You weren't my punishment, Layla," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. "You were my salvation." She leaned into his embrace as the stars multiplied overhead, their light reflecting off tears of gratitude in both their eyes. The desert crickets began their evening symphony, a peaceful chorus rising around them as they held each other under the vast Arizona sky. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.